Good morning and welcome. I'm Oliver Fitzgerald, a real estate partner in Mason Hayes and Curran. Today we're talking about the greening of real estate, green leases and green buildings. And this is a subject that to a certain extent does not need an introduction in 2021. Nobody needs to be told that issues of environmentalism and sustainability are becoming increasingly central for decision makers everywhere. We've seen globally and across many industries and sectors the huge growth and influence of ESG, meaning environmental, social and governance. In the built environment in real estate in Ireland, this has been no different. And in particular, green certifications like Lead have had an enormous effect on the market. From an investment perspective, the importance of these certifications continues to grow. They're now deal breakers for many investors and crucial targets in new builds. They're increasingly the minimum standards for such properties. In commercial leases, it's had a very substantial influence on transactions, and perhaps a surprising amount of negotiation now centres on green clauses in leases and on the delivery and maintenance of various green certifications and standards. And to a certain extent, this has changed and is changing the landlord and tenant relationship. All this has particularly affected high value new buildings and developments, and it seems likely that, as is often the case, the high value sectors of the market will set the standard that the rest of the market will ultimately follow. So what we're seeing at the top of real estate now might just be the future for everyone and everywhere. And before we get into today's agenda, we're going to take a brief poll to get a sense of how often people are coming across these issues. Sinead, would you mind putting that up there? So as you can see there, what we're asking is, how often have you been affected by green initiatives in your work, green lease clauses, LEED or other certifications, green reporting or compliance? And bearing in mind that today's audience is a property sector audience, very much so. Okay, we'll move on then. Now, I can't say I'm an expert on ESG or green certifications, but fortunately we're joined by guests here who are, we're joined by a diverse panel with wide experience in the area. Nellie Reid is Managing Director of Meehan Green Sustainability Consultants and an expert in the area of green certifications. Nellie will be familiar to many, having acted for owners and occupiers on many of the city's largest green projects. Nellie's going to do the main talk today and talk us through green certifications, what they are, how they operate, and how they've worked in Ireland. We're then going to move on and have a panel-like discussion about how all these initiatives and influences are affecting real estate and the built environment in Ireland. Nellie will join us for that discussion, but we'll also be joined by Andrew Cunningham, who is head of offices at Savills. The office sector has been one of the most affected by the new green certifications and standards and other green influences. And there are a few better placed in the Irish market than Andrew to explain how this is affecting deals on the ground. We're also joined by Shane Caldwell, who's a Senior Portfolio Manager and Sustainability Lead at IPUT. IPUT are well known in the market for being at the forefront of green initiatives, and they're on track to achieve net zero operational emissions by 2030. They have over 1 million square feet of office space environmentally certified or targeting environmental certification on completion. It'll be very interesting to hear Shane's perspective as an owner and manager of a substantial amount of green space. We'll have the Q&A function, as always, available to type your questions into, and we'll pick up those questions as we go through the event. Before I pass over to Nellie, who's going to do her talk, as I mentioned at the outset, we might just look at the results of the poll there, Sinead. Okay, that's quite a broad spread there. Thankfully, nobody's saying, or very few people are saying never, which would have made the event seem less important. But we do have plenty of dailies and weeklies and monthlies, which is interesting. And I think one of the points we'll be making now, or one of the points I think the guests might make, is that this is only going to grow. So there was always a chance that some people might not see it every day, but we do expect that to grow. Nellie, we might pass over to you now at this point.
Sure. I will share my screen there. Welcome everybody. I'm surprised actually in that poll to see that it's that more people aren't hearing about it on a daily basis. So I'm thinking that social media must be very smart, because in my LinkedIn and Facebook feeds, all I see is posts about sustainability. So it must be, the cookies must be working right to know that that's what's on my mind every day. I will share this now. Okay, so what I'm going to talk us through is, there's a lot of different things we could talk about in terms of sustainability in the real estate industry. And so I kind of want to put some guardrails on the conversation today and say that we're primarily looking at voluntary green building certification schemes. And the reason the word voluntary is so important is these are not things that are mandated by law or by any regulation. It's green building certification schemes that are things that developers do to differentiate themselves from the rest of the market, and to be kind of one step ahead of the regulations. So there's all kinds of things we could talk about in terms of Ireland's climate action bill and EU regulations, but I'm focusing specifically on the voluntary certification schemes that are prevalent in Ireland. Now, to start off, after a 3-day bank holiday weekend, and we were all enjoying our time outdoors, and maybe the first time in a restaurant outdoors since last summer, I hate to start out with this doom and gloom, but this is kind of the reality of what we're dealing with here. First we had kind of this wave of COVID-19, the pandemic, that seemed like an absolutely insurmountable crisis, and we are dealing with it. The vaccine rollout is working. As people are getting vaccinated, the cases of COVID are going down, and we're kind of getting past that wave. Unfortunately, what's probably already starting to happen is some sort of economic recession because of the shutdown of the hospitality and tourism industries and other things, people not going to work. There's going to be some sort of financial impact there. What's even bigger than that, though, is what's coming at us, and it's further out on the horizon, is climate change is already happening around the world. But if we don't address it now, we're going to have this big issue to deal with in a few years' time. So what people are trying to do with voluntary certification schemes is get ahead of that. And then even beyond just climate change and the impact it has on human life and prosperity, it's biodiversity collapse. So when you hear people talking about saving the bees, it's actually a much bigger issue of saving the diversity of species on the planet, and that's kind of the biggest issue we've got in charge of in front of us. So in terms of how does that deal with the real estate industry in particular, and what pathway do we need to get on to kind of tackle some of these big issues? There's a pretty broad EU initiative to reach carbon neutral by 2050, so net zero carbon by 2050. So we've really only got we've got less than 30 years to get to this net zero carbon target. So in order to get to that target, we have to take small steps to get there, and everything from government policy to investors to developers, designers, manufacturers, even nonprofits, everybody's working towards that goal. And it requires immediate action, and we all have to start collaborating. And we have been in some cases, but there needs to be more cross-sector collaboration. In Ireland in particular, there was an Irish Climate Action Plan that was publicized in 2019, and even since then, in 2020, there was the Irish Climate Action Bill, and there is a section in that specifically on the built environment. So what I'm trying to do here is drill down to how do we in the real estate industry need to be thinking about how we design buildings differently to address the Climate Action Plan. And there are very specific things that we can be doing in the built environment, both existing and new buildings, to take small steps towards carbon neutrality. And just on the economic or the environmental crisis as well, saving our green spaces, not just manicured, lawned green spaces, but diverse green spaces with lots of plant species and habitat for lots of species is important to keep kind of the balance of nature working for us. And if we don't stay in balance, you see things like this. On the left is a picture in Dublin when there was flooding in Dublin in 2019. And then the picture on the right is in Cork. These events are happening more frequently, and we need to reverse this trend. Otherwise, we're literally going to be underwater. So, climate change is already happening, and we need to not just address it, but reverse it. So where do we come into this with the green building certifications? Meehan Green is the only LEED proven provider in Ireland, and LEED is one of the green building certification schemes I'll be talking about. But with the green building certification schemes, it requires kind of an in-depth knowledge of how the certification program works, the documentation process. It's an integrated approach working with architects, engineers, contractors, everybody across the board. And so we come from a diverse set of backgrounds in architecture, engineering, economics, to kind of come into design teams and construction teams to integrate the conversation about sustainability across all the different disciplines. And, we're here in Ireland, but we're not a design practice. We're not architects, we're not engineers. We're here to just help kind of accelerate the pace of change in the building industry in Ireland. Now, kind of some of the programs I'll be talking about. See, there we go. We look at things like LEED consulting. WELL is another rating system that's out there. Fitwell. We do LCA analysis. LCA is looking at life cycle assessment, where you look at the embodied carbon footprint of buildings. So that can apply to new buildings, and also looking at ways to decarbonize existing buildings. There's different rating systems like BREEAM, and HPI is an Irish specific program that was launched by the Irish Green Building Council. And it relates to the performance of homes, not just single family homes, but multifamily residential homes as well. And just so that you all know kind of where we stand in the timeline of voluntary green building certifications, they've been around since 1990. The first one was the BREEAM certification, which was launched in the UK in 1990. The US Green Building Council launched the LEED rating system, and it was modeled after BREEAM. So you may find that there's similarities in BREEAM and LEED, and that's because the founders of the LEED rating system really looked to BREEAM as their model for developing the LEED rating system. Other things that you might have come across are the Living Building Challenge, which was a challenge to the industry to say, can we actually achieve net zero carbon, net zero water, and actually have a positive impact on the environment? And that was actually back in 2006. So that's already 15 years old. And so the conversations we're having in Ireland right now about achieving net zero carbon, net zero water, net zero energy, that was all put into place 15 years ago through the Living Building Challenge. And then there's the WELL building standard is more focused on the health and wellness of occupants in buildings as opposed to the environmental impact of buildings. And that you see a lot more of now today. It was only launched in 2014, and it's already picking up quite a bit of pace in Ireland. And so you're starting to see more things like zero carbon, WELL community, and the WELL health and safety rating was actually launched in response to the COVID pandemic. For people coming back to work, they can get a WELL health safety rating, which shows that the building is addressing the health and wellness of the occupants and minimizing exposure to the COVID virus. Now, LEED is a rating system that's used all over the world. So even though it was initially started in the US, it's in almost every country around the world. And there's over 100,000 registered projects, 58,000 certified projects across the globe. What's interesting about LEED is it's the same standard in every country. It's different than BREEAM because in BREEAM, the baseline in each country is whatever the local building standard is. So if the local building standard in Ireland is much more stringent than in Africa, then a BREEAM building in Ireland has a higher baseline. Whereas with LEED, the baseline is the same all over the world. And so when you're comparing a building in Ireland to a building in Africa, you're comparing it against the same rating system. And there's different LEED rating systems for different building types. So you might think, okay, well, LEED is just for new buildings. No, it's not. It's for new buildings, it's for fit outs, it's for existing buildings. So if you're looking at a whole portfolio, there's a LEED rating system that looks at the operation and maintenance of existing buildings. There's LEED for homes, LEED for neighborhood development, which looks at entire master plans. And what's different with LEED as opposed to just like a BER energy rating or meeting NZEB requirements is LEED is not just looking at energy performance, it's looking at how you deal with the site and the landscaping and the site infrastructure and parking. It's looking at stormwater, it's looking at what materials you're using in the building, the sourcing of the raw materials for the building, the indoor environmental quality in the building, and even innovation. Are you doing things that go above and beyond? It's kind of like an extra credit category. And also, how do people get to the site? Access to public transit, cycling, alternative means of transportation, and walkability. So LEED looks at all these different categories, not just focused on energy and carbon. Now, in Ireland specifically, LEED, even just going back to 2012, there were only a handful of LEED projects in Ireland in 2012. And it was mainly the US multinational companies that were bringing LEED with them to Ireland, because LEED would have been part of their corporate policy. So they would have said, look, I'll take example, Facebook comes to Ireland and they say, well, LEED is our standard. We will only move into buildings that are LEED rated. And so that was driving the market. But then suddenly there was this huge influx of developers, commercial developers, and even the public sector pursuing the LEED certification system. And that's because there was this global kind of adoption of LEED as the universal standard across the globe. And it was also because of GRESB. GRESB reporting is a global real estate sustainable building kind of corporate ESG reporting mechanism that a lot of developers and investors report through. And in the GRESB reporting, they give points for if your buildings have any voluntary third green building certification. So buildings that achieve a LEED rating help their clients achieve a higher GRESB score. So it contributes to that corporate picture of how you're doing in terms of sustainability. What's interesting to note here, though, is almost, more than half of the buildings in Ireland that pursue LEED pursue gold. And what that tells us is the Irish green building regs are more stringent than the global average. So because Part L and NZEB are in place, and because Ireland already has requirements for accommodation for cyclists, and because a lot of these buildings are in Dublin where there is public transportation and there is walkability and public infrastructure in place, Dublin especially is very well positioned for buildings to achieve LEED Gold. Fairly straightforward. It's only when you go for LEED Platinum that you kind of have to do that extra push and go beyond the building regulations. So in Ireland, we're finding LEED Platinum is really the only kind of market differentiation. LEED Gold is meeting kind of a baseline standard of sustainability in Ireland, but it is still a voluntary certification scheme. So it is still acknowledged by multinationals as something that they're looking for if they're looking to purchase buildings or lease space. LEED Gold still has some market advantage there, but LEED Platinum is really the exemplary projects. And there's loads of LEED buildings in Ireland. So some of you, may be working on these, may have worked on them to some extent. But there's over 100 LEED certified projects in Ireland. And as you can see, it's a lot of multinationals and a few pharmaceutical, medical device companies, tech companies. And there's even more registered projects. Projects that are registered are in design or in construction, but are not completed yet. And so we are seeing this kind of wave of LEED certified buildings in Ireland. These are just kind of an example in case you're walking around Dublin and you're wondering, well, you know, which buildings in Dublin are LEED certified, or if you're outside of Dublin, there's a few here, like in Shannon, there's actually Shannon Commercial Properties has taken LEED as their new kind of policy for new buildings. So there's a whole row of LEED buildings down at outside Shannon Airport. But most of the projects are Dublin based, and then there's some in Limerick and some in Cork and Galway as well. Now, moving on from the LEED certification and getting the plaque on the wall, there's been some criticism of the LEED rating system in that you get your certification and then the buildings get occupied and they get maintained, but how are the buildings actually performing? And so this is the next wave that we're going to see, is buildings participating in the ARC platform. The ARC platform is a cloud-based global reporting platform where buildings can actually keep track of their energy, waste, and water and ongoing procurement of materials through a database and track their performance in real time, so that you can actually see if the building that was LEED Platinum in the initial certification, is it actually performing to that performance target. And this is really important because people have said, you know, we need to focus more on science-based target and on data. You know, show me the data. And so this is a very important thing to do, which is to make sure they're actually tracking the performance of the building, and it's not just hypothetical kind of anticipated performance, but actual performance. And so the LEED rating system fits into the ARC platform. So once a building is reaches practical completion and you get your plaque on the wall and you've got your tenants in and the operators on board, what they can do is after 12 months of occupancy, they can enter into the ARC platform and continue to monitor the performance of that building through the ARC platform. So we imagine that being the next wave, because as you see, there's 100 LEED certified buildings in Ireland and 200 plus that are registered. Well, all of those hundreds of buildings can now be tracked in this ARC platform. So that's what we're trying to accelerate, is getting people into the performance-based tracking. And it also, as I mentioned earlier, then feeds into the building certification piece of the GRESB reporting, which a lot of our clients are doing. And so that's also important to them, that they can continue to report on their projects through the GRESB model. Now in Ireland, there's only a small kind of, Ireland only plays a small picture in this big, in the global context in terms of companies that have signed into the ARC platform. So what we'd like to do is get a lot more buildings in Ireland into this ARC platform so that they can be tracked in this global database. Now, a lot of people ask me, well, what happens when we get to net zero carbon? People are thinking big picture, once we get to 2050. And I would love to actually get to 2050 and we get to net zero carbon, net zero energy, net zero water, and we say we're done, our job is done, we can all retire and go on holiday. But when we get to net zero, all that means is that we have zero impact. We're not improving our impact. And so it's really a journey that we need to take, and we need to be thinking about, once we get to zero, how do we actually have a positive impact, and how do we sequester carbon and actually capture carbon and reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, because that's the biggest issue with climate change. And how do we actually restore the environment and create places that actually make people healthier and happier, and not just have zero impact on people. So just to think about that in terms of the bigger context of where we're going with this. And so on that note, the WELL rating system is a kind of a parallel rating system. So if LEED is more focused on the environment and the environmental impact of buildings, WELL is a voluntary certification scheme that's focused on the people inside the buildings and the impact that buildings have on the occupants. They're both administered by the same organization, which means it's very easy to pursue both LEED and WELL ratings. And a lot of our clients are pursuing both side by side because they're streamlined in the way you document the projects. And the reason WELL is so important from an economic standpoint is when you look at the life of a building over 30 years and you look at, you know, how much money is spent in a building over 30 years, a very small amount of the expenditure in a building is used on utility bills, energy bills. And then there's a certain amount of money spent on the rent, you know, renting the space and operating the building. But the biggest expense in a building or in a company is paying people's salaries. And so in order to attract and retain those employees and maintain your business culture and to maintain your success of your business, you want to keep your people in those buildings, keep them happy, keep them healthy. Some people say that a facility manager has more impact on your health than your GP. If you think about it, you go to your GP once or twice a year, if that, and you talk to them for 15 minutes and they might prescribe you some medicine to make you feel better. Well, your facility manager, if you're spending 8 hours a day in your office, that building is having more impact on your health than your doctor or anything that you do. If you get up every day at 6 a.m. and you go for a run and you do yoga and you do meditation before you go to bed, that has some impact on your health. But the physical environment and your social interactions at work have more impact on your health than anything else. So WELL is also, Ireland's actually skyrocketing into the WELL scene. A year ago, there were only 20 WELL projects in Ireland, and there's now 50. So it's accelerating quite quickly in Ireland. And WELL looks at all these different things from air and water quality to the food that's offered in the building, to your access to daylight, to, you know, interconnecting stairs, encouraging people to use the stairs instead of elevators, community, the impact on health and wellness, and even sound, like acoustics in the office can have an impact on your health. And so there are a few WELL projects in Ireland now that some of these you might recognize from walking around Dublin. Most of these are in Dublin, actually. I'm just looking at that. We have a few WELL projects in Cork and Limerick as well. Now, just to kind of leave you guys with something relevant to the discussion today, but initially we were talking about green clauses in tenant lease agreements, and just to kind of frame this, you know, get a little bit more specific, some of the things related to LEED and WELL that might come into discussion in a lease agreement would be the HVAC systems. Are they complying with LEED and WELL? And if a tenant comes in and wants to change the HVAC systems, are they LEED and WELL compliant? That's a big issue. Plumbing fixtures, I know it may seem like a little thing, but it always seems to be a big deal when it comes to tenant-landlord relationships, which is the flow rates of the plumbing fixtures, and can you use rainwater harvesting for plumbing fixtures? Sometimes that becomes an issue with tenants coming on board, you know, not necessarily being aligned on those performance requirements. No smoking may seem like a no-brainer, but with LEED buildings, you can't even smoke on terraces or in courtyards within a certain distance of a building entrance, so that can be an issue. Lighting, you know, there's requirements in LEED for, you know, tenants to comply to only purchasing mercury-free lamps. Entryway systems, so you may see going into LEED buildings, you'll see people having kind of a long walk-off mat or a grill that basically captures dirt when people are coming into a building. That's a requirement in LEED as well. And then dealing with parking, how you allocate parking, electric vehicle charging, preferred parking for carpoolers, things like that, or expecting mothers. Those are all things that come into the LEED and WELL rating system as well. So, and I'll just leave you with the link to the Green Lease Toolkit, which some of you may be familiar with, but it is probably the best resource out there for if you're working on negotiating a lease and wondering what kinds of things you need to be looking at. There's model green leases there that you can access. And so that's it for us today. Thank you for your time, and I will pass it back over to Oliver for the panel.
Thanks, Nellie. And sorry, everything there was relevant, so don't worry. It's the general. It was just great to see the kind of a visual representation of all these certifications. So it's certainly kind of almost any information in that area is relevant to the built environment. So thanks for that. We're joined now, as you'll see, by Shane Caldwell of IPUT and by Andrew Cunningham of Savills, and we're going to do a Q&A or panel now, and feel free to put your questions into the Q&A function. We're going to start first with landlord and tenant, because I suppose the panelists do feel that that's driving a lot of things in this area. And we're then going to move on to investment, and we're then going to maybe look to the future and consider do some blue sky thinking. It might be a bit ambitious, but we'll call it that. So Andrew, if I might turn to you first, how big an issue are green requirements in lease transactions at the moment, commercial lease transactions?
Thanks, Oliver. I suppose the real thing is on the CBD buildings that we're working on now, it has become much bigger as an issue, and we're starting to see the section of leases that are handed over to sustainability growing. It used to be that you'd see a couple of sentences somewhere in a lease about it, but now we're seeing much bigger sections coming into leases on greening leases, and we're starting to see guidance from clients in terms of some of the clauses that they want to see go into heads of terms and make their way then into leases. So I mean, typically the stuff we're seeing, funny enough, Nellie talked about there, some of the specific clauses, they probably get covered in a more holistic way in the terms of the clauses that actually come into leases. So things like, tenants are required not to compromise the green credentials of the landlord's base build. And that, more recently with GRESB, what we're starting to see is clauses about data sharing. So the tenants are having to, particularly even in multi-let buildings, but it's harder for landlords to get data off single-let buildings, and typically in those situations, you have these legacy leases where the tenants aren't obliged to give data on energy consumption or waste management or air quality over to the landlord. So they're getting written into the new leases, and so it really flows around data sharing. The first thing is, I guess, if you can't measure it, how do you improve it? And I think certainly we're seeing that as a key thing now at the moment, which opens itself up to questions about data protection. So we've, on a deal I was involved with, where we started trying to introduce requirements around data sharing, we also had to manage the privacy and the data protection as part of that.
Yeah, thanks for that, Andrew. And Shane, what has IPUT's approach been to green leases? What are your view, the biggest challenges?
I suppose Andrew's after giving a good overview there, but we've been incorporating green leases and clauses within even our heads of terms document. So from the outset of a lot of negotiations to get it in there early, and the majority of that has been around, as Andrew was saying, if you have a LEED certified building, there's a requirement as part of your LEED certification that you have to have certain clauses in there in your lease. But also the approach we've taken is that kind of sharing, data sharing piece, particularly for the GRESB reporting requirements. So a lot of the focus has been on that. And it is, I suppose, there is this traditional mindset, landlord and tenant, that it isn't that collaborative. But I guess a key part of what we at IPUT try to do is with our occupiers is like focus on trying to collaborate. And certainly, if you can start sharing that data, it gives opportunities really as well, where you can identify areas where you could, improve the performance of the building. And oftentimes that comes then with a financial implication where there's particularly cost savings for a tenant, whether it's in a multi-let through a service charge or in a single let, that they're able to reduce their overheads as well. So hopefully that shift, we'll see that shift gaining momentum over the next couple of years. And I suppose it's one of the things where we often see the pushback might be from maybe the solicitor, first off, pushes it back, says, no, we're not agreeing to those terms. I haven't seen those before. But even that has changed. And we would have seen recently where even now tenants are looking to put in their own green clauses in leases. So that's really, I suppose, a signpost of the way things are going to go. Tenants or occupiers have their own corporate social responsibility requirements. So there's starting to become alignment there. I think that will facilitate the growth of green lease clauses within leases.
Thanks, Shane, and it's yeah, good to you're lining up with Andrew on the solicitors because Andrew had to go on Friday, so you're obviously working together there. But I won't try and defend the profession. I do think the collaboration is going to be a challenge for solicitors, because it's, in a way, it's almost the opposite of what we're supposed to be doing. But you know, at the same time, I think we all know that we need to move in that direction as a profession generally, and particularly as regards green requirements, because there is everybody needs to work together on it. But interesting to hear you say that, and also Andrew on Friday. Andrew, I might return to you on just what sort of green clauses do you think have been causing the most issues in transactions?
I suppose, you know, on a lot of buildings I work on, you know, we're doing pre-lets. So, you know, there's certain, you know, the landlord or developer will have a lead target. And, you know, there were early issues on, you know, the first lead buildings coming through about lead certification. It takes a bit of time, you know, when you reach practical completion. And in early AFLs, the lead certification was included as a deliverable for practical completion to occur, and yet it might take a number of months. Now, you know, we're starting to see precedents around that, and we're starting to see that, you know, there's a tolerance period to achieve the lead certification. And the other thing that we would have seen then was kind of already mentioned it, that some tenants were pushing back and saying, look, you know, just because you're going for lead gold or lead platinum, you know, don't impose that on my fit out because it's adding cost. I think what we're starting to see, and it's been a, you know, real change in this in the last 18 months, is that occupiers are now, you know, having to make disclosures. They're having to make statements about carbon and energy, and they're starting to understand that, you know, if they're going to be reporting this in their annual statements, then they need to, you know, sign up to their fit outs, not compromising what the landlords want to do. And equally, the landlords want to protect the investment that they've made in the buildings, the extra investment. At future rent reviews, they don't want the lead certification that they achieve to be compromised. So there was a lot around that at the start. And then, you know, the questions arose about, you know, what happens if the developer or landlord doesn't achieve the lead certification that they said they would achieve? What happens? And, you know, various debates, solicitors like yourself get involved in terms of, you know, what is the recourse if that happens? It's damages. Is it, you know, something more severe than that? Is it, you know, a financial, you know, prescribed financial penalty? And we would have been haggling over a lot of that stuff, but the precedents are starting to be set down now at this stage.
Thanks, Andrew. And Nellie, just working off a question I see there in the Q&A, and something I've noticed as well in your presentation, the ARC platform is going to involve a lot of ongoing maintenance and reporting and ongoing compliance. Is there a risk of people losing certifications there, and that affecting the landlord and tenant relationship, or causing trouble?
So no, the ARC platform, like let's say you find out you have a LEED Platinum building and it's only performing at a LEED Silver level, you know, in after occupancy. The plaque was to certify the design and construction of the building. So it was there to certify the design intent and the construction works. And it's a paper-based exercise where you basically say this building is designed to achieve this performance, and the construction complied with all of the LEED requirements and we documented everything, and you get the plaque. That plaque can't be taken away because that plaque certifies at a point in time. So that building was LEED certified, let's say in 2019. If you find that the building is underperforming in the ART platform, that just means that the building can't recertify at the same level. So buildings can recertify every few years through the ARC platform. And you might actually have a case where you have a LEED gold building performing at a platinum level. So they can actually, you know, jump up to platinum. And some buildings may actually go up or down from there. But the idea is that you can use it as a way to kind of gauge yourself. But no, you wouldn't, the plaque wouldn't be taken away.
So in a way, it actually could facilitate the kind of working together approach
Yes.
in the way that we've discussed, rather than being a negative thing. Yeah,
Exactly.
interesting. Andrew, one more question we might just touch on in the landlord and tenant section before we move on to investment more generally. How are green lease requirements, certifications, clauses, etc., affecting rent reviews? Have you seen it affect rents and rent reviews?
Yeah, it's certainly there on the agenda. I mean, maybe for the last 12 months, you know, where there was a review date that landed post-COVID, that's been probably on the minds of surveyors more so. But I do think that the relative energy performance is something that is definitely coming up. So, you know, one of the things we're seeing is that you've got probably the first wave of LEED buildings are coming towards their first rent reviews 5 years in. So, you know, buildings we would have worked on early, like Vertium, that would have had LEED ranking, are now heading towards rent review. But more so what we're seeing is when you're trying to do rent reviews of slightly older buildings, maybe with, you know, C-rated, D-rated BERs, and evidence is being created in the marketplace on A-rated buildings and LEED gold or LEED platinum buildings, is that how do you translate that through to the rent reviews? So, you know, typically you take comparable evidence, you kind of analyze it for the incentives that have been given, and then you get into the pros and cons of one building versus another based on location and that. But energy is now one of those that's coming into it. Now, it's funny, it's very hard to understand whether LEED gold or LEED platinum, you know, how do you measure it? But it's much easier to look at energy consumption, and you can translate that into relative costs for the tenants in a building. And we've seen that, you know, we even did a C-rated building recently, and, you know, again, it was being put up against A-rated evidence. If you look at it, I mean, you know, for a 150,000 square foot building, we did an analysis recently through our own energy team on, you know, a D2 rated building versus an A2 rated building, and you know, the transfer in terms of cost per annum was around 350,000. So, you know, if you can see that coming into rent reviews as an adjustment factor that's going to come into analyzing relative comparisons. So absolutely, and you know, when COVID settles down, I think energy will become one of the big areas of dispute at rent reviews.
Yeah, to jump in on that point, I suppose Nellie touched on it now, Andrew, like performance, whatever about the certification at the point in time, and it's great getting your building design there, but the performance element of it is going to be much more important. And we see that, and I think when we see the occupiers now looking to put green clauses into leases, that's maybe some of their motivation as well. Okay, we're after signing a lease for this sustainable building. We want to see how it performs, and we want to get some feedback there as well. And that's a key thing that at IPUT that we're trying to do, is engage with our occupiers to understand the performance and share that data in a collaborative way. Haven't seen any impact on rent reviews yet, but it is something that is going to become much more important. Is that analysis of the performance. And when you look at the different benchmarks, such as GRESB, for example, they're getting much more, or requiring much more granular data on the performance of buildings. And certainly our investors will be looking for much more detail and data on the asset level performance, so building by building performance.
I think Shane, interestingly, and Nellie has touched on this, you know, we might be a little bit crude in just comparing an A versus a D rated building, you know, whereas that certification may have occurred 4 or 5 years previous. some landlords are investing continually, and some aren't. And it's probably about, as you come up to rent reviews, particularly as big ones go to third party, it will be about looking at the data. What was the data like in the year up to the rent review date? What was each building consuming in terms of energy, rather than just looking, historically to the accreditation that it received at the start.
Yeah, but I think that's where that collaboration is going to become more important, as well as understanding it, because we have the responsibility for the performance. Is it the landlord? Is it the tenant? And like what steps we're taking. So it's changing that model from maybe traditionally only talking every 5 years when it comes around to review, to having an ongoing discussion. And like we would do that in our multi-lets, where we'd have green forums. So we'd sit down with our tenants on a quarterly basis, understand what their issues they're having. So that would be our facilities team talking to the facilities practitioners within our occupiers organizations, and just trying to understand that performance part.
Yes, thanks, guys.
Could I just interject there once,
Yes.
Oliver, just to touch on something that might be a hot topic, but or a hot button. The new buildings are doing really well. Like in the last 5 years, the Irish building industry has really embraced high performance buildings. And part of that is because of Part L and NZEB and the building regulations themselves. But new buildings are doing well in Ireland. It's the existing buildings. So it's the 80% of the buildings that are sitting there that are very not efficient, that need to be brought up to current standards. And so from an energy and carbon perspective, if a developer or if a property owner is looking at how to decarbonize their portfolio, there's certain tools that we have to look at new buildings, but then we have another set of tools we need to use to look at the existing buildings and find ways to make those more perform at a higher level. And so I think that's kind of the next big push, will be looking at those existing buildings and what are the easy things that we can do, small steps that will have a big impact over the next few years.
Thanks. Yeah, and we might actually move to that issue, because I think this is something we've discussed before. I think you were missing, Nellie, on that occasion, but myself and Shane and Andrew discussed it, and it is a difficult issue because there are a lot of buildings that are not obviously up to this standard, and getting them there is easier said than done. And Andrew and Shane, would you have any advice for people dealing with those large portfolios?
Yeah,
like
well, maybe I'll just pick up that point first. I suppose we, last September, this ties into it, last September we made a commitment that we'd have be net zero operationally by 2030. So it's this World Green Building Council commitment. And so anything that we directly manage, any of our assets that we directly manage, that operationally they'd be net zero carbon, and that we start to design all our new developments so that they can operate at net zero carbon. So if we take our standing in our standing stock of our existing assets, there's like a real mix, or there's a number of layers there in terms of like the age profile, the sustainability credentials of those buildings. So the approach that we kind of take is that you have to look at all track the performance is the first thing we do, and then you start to audit those buildings, and you start to, I suppose, categorize them in a way that you can say, okay, well, where are the easy wins here? Are there things that we can do to optimize performance? Are there things that we need to leave for 3 or 4 years down the line when it becomes a refurbishment or redevelopment place? So I suppose it's taking a step back and just using the tools that Nellie has alluded to as well, just to audit all your assets and just see what level of intervention that you require, and then having a strategic plan for that going forward. And that's kind of a key part of our net zero pathway, which we hope to bring out later this summer. And it's just taking that sort of science-based approach to it all.
Thanks, Shane. Andrew, any thoughts on that beyond
Yeah,
that?
I think a lot of landlords are grappling with this, and a lot of them are worried about it, and they're worried about where they're going to be benchmarked against others. I think maybe I'd have a different approach to it, and I'd look at, you know, have a plan for each asset, you know, understand, you know, what are the incremental things you need to do, and what is the ultimate level you can get to in terms of energy performance. Is that acceptable to you? If it's not, then you need to look at bigger decisions. But if it is acceptable, you know, do you need to align lease events so that you can take on some of the bigger elements that have to be done? And aligning lease events typically involves having to incur some letting voids, or, you know, to get everything lined up so you can make the big interventions. Or are there just, is there just stuff you can do, you know, small stuff while tenants are in the building, working around them in partnership, showing them the benefit of doing this work? And then is there just some stuff that's just operationally just not good? And that's where the measurement comes in, you know, like literally just, you know, are lights turning off? Are you doing some just basic stuff? So you need to, you know, look at it, have a plan. I wouldn't be afraid of it. You know, I do see an emergence of different rents. You know, we're starting to see it, that maybe there's less pressure on the new ESG stock in terms of headline rents and where they're at and incentives, and we're able to get maybe longer term leases on them. So you can still go and let, you know, B and C rated buildings, but it's just going to get harder. So it's about having a plan so that, you know, you're not boxing yourself into a corner in another 5 or 6 years and wondering how you got to that place. You know, you just it's about, you know, facing up to it and getting on with it. You know, and there will be some capex involved. You know, but, you know, I think it's a good type of capex.
So thanks, Andrew. And Shane, just to go to the kind of higher level ESG stuff. How do I put and measure compliance with ESG performance at that kind of higher level?
Yeah, well, it's certainly over the last couple of years, it's a growing area in terms of regulation and the amount of disclosure that's required. Nellie mentioned GRESB earlier, so that's the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark. So GRESB is a benchmark which basically assesses the ESG performance of real estate funds globally. So there are over 1,000 assets within this portfolio or within this benchmark. There are, and we've been participating in it. This year will be the 6th year that we've been participating in it. So that benchmark is something which investors really use as a lens to, you know, assess and analyze the performance of your property portfolio. So not just the environmental, like the consumption, that is becoming something that they're looking for a lot more detail on, but it's also around your management, so your strategy, your processes, all those things that you have in place. And we have seen where there are investors out there, whether it's your alliances or your CBRE Global Investors, these large institutions, that they will make decisions and investment decisions based on your performance. So it's there's a 5-star rating. Last year we achieved a 4-star rating for our standing investments and our developments. But we've seen now where and got feedback where there are funds who will say, well, if you're not, let's say, a minimum of a 3 or a 4-star, we actually won't invest money into you. So we use that kind of framework and that benchmark to disclose our performance, because it's something there that is probably the most globally accepted one out there in terms of real estate organizations.
That's why, Oliver, when I said, you know, there's good capex here, that translates into investment value. And so, you know, we're seeing it from our investment teams are telling us that, you know, following the occupier move onto environmental credentials because they have to make disclosures, they're seeing it in terms of the liquidity. You can still trade, you know, lesser rated stock, but there's less liquidity for it. And you know, there's a bigger buyer pool for ESG stock because of the reasons that Shane is talking about there.
But GRESB, the other thing, just I suppose, GRESB is voluntary. Like I said, this is our 6th year doing it. But with the EU taxonomy, there's becoming more regulatory requirements now as well. And that's, I suppose, that's the shift as well over the last 18 months. There's the FDR regulation, and really the way Nellie referred to the climate bill earlier as well. So really, I see the next step or the next phase of that being more regulatory requirements on organizations to, again, report on their performance. So that's the next challenge, really, for occupiers, for landlords, for developers, is just having one eye on that. So for us, it's about making decisions now which will build in that resilience and make sure that we're on the front foot when it comes to these changes. Because with a large portfolio, sometimes it can take a while just to I suppose, get everything up and running and make sure that engagement is there, so you can bring your occupiers along with you as well.
Great, thanks both. And I think with our 4 minutes left, we might very quickly look to the future. It's always going to be difficult. Nellie, I might just go to you first. Your background obviously is in the States, and you worked there for many years in this area. And I noticed from your presentation that these standards have been around for so long in the States and in use for so long, relatively new thing here. As you mentioned, what are we yet to learn? What do you think is the next big thing, if that can be answered?
Yeah, sure. I guess, up till now, with everything everyone's focused on, it's how to reduce the operational carbon footprint of buildings. So it's reducing energy use in buildings and where that energy is coming from, looking at, who your energy providers are, and is it renewable energy, or is it, coming from fossil fuels? It's basically focusing on the carbon footprint of buildings in their occupancy phase. What we're seeing a lot of now is actually getting into, when you're building a new building, what is the carbon footprint of the materials in those, in the building materials? So it's called embodied carbon, and it's how much carbon is embodied in the building itself. And so when you're sourcing raw materials and looking at where your concrete comes from, where your steel comes from, where the timber is coming from, all the different bits that go into the fit out, the carpeting, the ceiling tiles, what is the amount of carbon used to produce those materials and transport them to the site. And that is a piece of the carbon pie that hasn't really been defined very well until the last few years. And so there's a few tools out there now that we're using, like one-click LCA, and there's something called the EC3 tool, which was launched through some funding with Skanska, and it's quickly coming into the market. But there are technologies and things that we can be doing to, we have to actually talk through the entire supply chain, go back all the way through the supply chain to find out how can we reduce the carbon footprint of the building materials from the point of extraction to the point that they're put into the building. Even things like modularization or offsite construction, doing as much assembly offsite as you can to reduce waste on construction sites, things like that. We're really getting into the nitty-gritty of the materials in the building and the embodied carbon piece of that carbon pie.
Perfect, thanks. And we're up to 12 o'clock, so I'm conscious of time, so I won't keep anyone any longer. There is a survey going to be sent around by our marketing team, so we'd encourage you to complete that. But apart from that, we'll leave it there. And thanks everyone for joining, and thanks to the panelists for being here. It was great to hear from all of you, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
How about thanks?
Bye.